Shakti official, please reply.
Yes. You can start now. Please go ahead.
Vande Parama Satyam. Greetings to all of you and welcome to Shakti. Namaskar, I am Buddhadev Ghosh, today's on-screen coordinator. We are happy to have our chief guest of today, Swami Medhananda, an eminent scholar of philosophy and language from Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education, RIMSE, Mysore. Along with you all, we are here in this much-awaited session of today with a very brilliant title, Sri Aurobindo's integral Advaitic approach to the Iśā Upaniṣad. So now, following our tradition, we shall start our program today with a holy chanting from sacred Vedas. For that purpose, we may invite Sri Satin Sharmaji. Satin ji, Kripaya Vaidika Mantrena Anushtanasya Suchanam Yadisya Varam.
Om Sri Gurubhyo Namaha Harihi Om Prano Devi Saraswati Vaje Bhirvajinivati Hinama Vitriyavat Namo Brahmane Namo Astvagnaye Namah Prithivye Namah Oshadibhya Namo Vade Namo Vajaspataye Namo Vishnave Bruhate Karumi Ayam puro bhuvastasya prano bhauvayano vasantah pranayano gayatri vasanti gayatri gayatram gayatrat vapum surupagum shostrirutrivruthoratantaragum ratantarat vasishtharushih prajapati grihitayat tvaya pranam grihami prajabhyoyam dakshina Vishvakarma tasya mano vaishvakarmanam grishmo manasatrishtu grishmi trishtubha aidamaidatan taryamo taryamat panchatashat bruhato bharadvaja rushih prajapati grihitayat tvaya mano grunhami samjnanam vijnanam prajnanam janatabhijanat Sankalpamanam prakalpamanam apakalpamanam apaklaptam klaptam Shreyo vasiya ayat sambhutam bhutam Chitrah ketuh prabhana bhan sambhan Jyotishmagas tejasvana tapagyastapan Rochano rochamana shobhana shobhamana kalyana Harihi Om
After this beautiful prayer, we are going to welcome our chief guest of today formally. Before that, I request all of you who are not in any presentation or anything, please do unmute and off the video of yourself because it will decrease the bandwidth issue of others. So, for today's welcome address, we shall request Sri Gautam Banerjee. Sri Banerjee is a great admirer of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and a writer from the Obermann Foundation. Sir, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Ghosh. At this special occasion, I welcome everybody who is present here, and especially I welcome Swami Medhananda ji, Ayon Maharaj, who is one of the most dynamic and young monks of Sri Ramakrishna Monastic mission, and who is a great scholar in philosophy. He has done his PhD from University of California, Berkeley. Very recently, in 2009, on a very uncommon subject, dialectics of aesthetic agency, German aesthetics especially. He is the author of quite a few important books, the latest one of which is Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, which has been published from Oxford University Press. Another book, very interesting, very well read and accepted, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. This book was published in 2018. He is recipient of several fellowships around the world. So far as his knowledge in Vedantic philosophy, scriptural hermeneutics, the thoughts of Ramakrishna and Vivekananda, and of course, the philosophy of Sri Aurobindo is quite interesting. He has a deep knowledge in all the branches of philosophy, especially the Western philosophy, as well as the Eastern. He's a very prolific speaker. Every time one attends his talk, one is taken to the deep inside the subject. We are very lucky today to have him to deliver talk on the Iśā Upaniṣads, as the Upanishad has been envisioned by Sri Aurobindo. Iśā Upaniṣad, this comprises Sri Aurobindo's translations and commentaries. It is a book which has absolutely different insight from other treatises. Sri Aurobindo had a special interest on this Upanishad, whose principle of uncompromising reconciliation and uncompromising extremities underlies his own philosophy as well. He first translated the Upanishad around 1900, and over the next 14 years returned to it again and again. The integral yoga, which is especially a way of yoga that has been devised by Sri Aurobindo, is based on this particular Upanishad. Quite a few basic tenets of his yoga has been taken from this Iśā Upaniṣad. So today, to have a discussion on the translation and commentaries on this Upanishad by Sri Aurobindo from Swami Medhananda ji is really something that we cherish. So I again welcome Maharaj to deliver his speech for this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sri Gautam Banerjee, for the very generous introduction. Thank you, Buddha Bush and Shukriya for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation. The only annoying thing about Google Meet is that when I do the PowerPoint, I can't see anybody's faces. So I'll be speaking to just my screen. But I hope you guys are still there. Can someone confirm? Buddha Dev, can you just confirm that? Buddhadev, can you hear me? Okay, so I'll start my presentation, thanks, yeah. Okay, so as Sri Gautam Banerjee very insightfully pointed out, I'll be talking today about Sri Aurobindo's integral Advaitic approach to the Iśā Upaniṣad. Let me share my screen, just make sure that. Can you see my screen, the PowerPoint, both of them?
Yes, Maharaj.
Great.
We can.
All right. Very good. Okay, so my focus will be on Sri Aurobindo's approach to the Iśā Upaniṣad, and along the way, I'll be comparing his interpretations with those of Shankaracharya, the 8th century Advaitic Vedanta. But before I get into Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, I want to discuss two of his main influences, namely Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And it's something that's often overlooked, I think, but it's very important when we try to understand Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Vedantic scriptures, how his interpretations were informed and shaped to a certain extent by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. So to give you a little bit of background, I wanted to give a few slides. So first of all, according to Swami Vivekananda, traditional commentators like Shankara and Ramanuja and Madhva and others, they sometimes tortured scriptural texts. By that he meant that because they already subscribed to a particular philosophical framework, when they were confronted with passages in the Vedantic scriptures that didn't conform to their respective philosophies, they would often distort the meanings of these scriptural passages. So Swami Vivekananda suggested an entirely different way of interpreting the Vedantic scriptures. By Vedantic scriptures, I mean the Prasthanatraya primarily. So Upanishad, Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. So what Vivekananda recommended is that we should reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures from the harmonizing standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna. So this is what he said: no one can truly understand the Vedas and Vedanta unless one studies them in the light of the utterances of Sri Ramakrishna. So that's what Swami Vivekananda said. Now, what about Sri Aurobindo? In I think a passage which is not as widely known as it should be, in an essay called Karma Yoga, published in 1909, Sri Aurobindo said the following. He said, the word Vedanta is usually identified with a strict monism and the peculiar theory of Maya established by the lofty and ascetic intellect of Shankara. But it is the Upanishads themselves and not Shankara's writings, the text and not the commentary, that are the authoritative scripture of the Vedanta. Shankara's, great and temporarily satisfying as it was, is still only one synthesis and interpretation of the Upanishads. There have been others in the past which have powerfully influenced the national mind, and there is no reason why there should not be a yet more perfect synthesis in the future. It is such a synthesis, embracing all life and action in its scope, that the teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda have been preparing. So there are a lot of interesting points that Sri Aurobindo makes in this passage. And note that 1909 means this is at a quite an early phase in his spiritual career. One of the things he says, and this is a common mistake that a lot of people make, he notes that many people assume that Vedanta means Advaita Vedanta, and it's a serious mistake. And he says that Vedanta refers to Upanishads, and Shankara's interpretation is only one among many interpretations, but that the primary meaning of Vedanta is Upanishads themselves. And then he ends with that highlighted sentence. He ends by saying that it is now time to reinterpret the original Vedantic scriptures, namely the Upanishads, in the light of the teachings and the life of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. So he says this explicitly, and notice that this is 1909, which means before he actually published any of his scriptural commentaries. So I think this passage is a nice clue to understanding Sri Aurobindo's interpretive orientation, or we can call it his hermeneutic approach. He is interpreting the Vedantic scriptures in a new way. I mean, he's really making a break from the approach of the traditional commentators like Shankara and Ramanuja and Madhva, and he's reinterpreting these scriptures in the light of Sri Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So to understand how he does that, what exactly this hermeneutic approach consists in, we need to have some background in Sri Ramakrishna's ideas and some of Swami Vivekananda's as well. So that's what I'll be talking about before I get into Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad. So first of all, it seems to me that one of the most important and fundamental teachings of Sri Ramakrishna is his teachings on jnana and vijnana. So this is what Sri Ramakrishna says. And these teachings are especially influential on Sri Aurobindo. So let's read this carefully. Sri Ramakrishna, and this is taken from the Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, written by Mohandas Gupta and translated into English as the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The Jnani gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, neti, neti. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. So this Jnani is this Advaita Vedanta who attains the realization of the non-dual Nirguna Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of neti is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is Nirguna is also Saguna. So Nirguna here means without attributes and Saguna with attributes. A man cannot live on the roof for a long time. He comes down again. Those who realize Brahman in Samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as Vijnana. So there's a lot to unpack in this philosophically pregnant passage. So the Jnani, as I just mentioned, is the Advaita Vedantin who attains the realization of the impersonal, the Nirguna, Advaitic Brahman through the practice of neti sadhana, Jnana Yoga sadhana. But according to Sri Ramakrishna, there's a further spiritual state, which he calls Vijnana. And Sri Ramakrishna says that the Vijnani goes beyond the Advaitic Jnani by realizing that Brahman is not only impersonal, Nirguna, but also personal, Saguna. And it's on the basis of this spiritual experience or spiritual state of Vijnana that Sri Ramakrishna taught one of his most important teachings. Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. Brahmo Shakti Abhed. So by Brahman here, he means Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal absolute, Advaitic Brahman, and Shakti is Saguna Brahman or Ishvara. And in another place in the Kautamrita, he clarifies this teaching. He says, যখন তিনি নিষ্ক্রিয় তখন আমি ব্রহ্ম বলে কই, যখন তিনি সৃষ্টি স্থিতি প্রলয় করছেন তখন আমি শক্তি বলে কই, কালী বলে কই. So when I think of the ultimate reality as niskriya, which means inactive or static, then I call it Brahman. So that's the Nirguna Brahman. And when I think of that same reality as creating, preserving, and destroying the universe, I call that same reality Shakti or Kali. So that's what he means. He means that Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Shakti or Ishvara are equally real aspects, the static and dynamic aspects respectively of one and the same infinite divine reality. And the Vijnani also sees that it is Shakti, Saguna Brahman, that has become everything in the universe. So while the Jnani dismisses the universe as a framework of illusion, Sri Ramakrishna's Bangla expression is Thokantaki. So this is like the Advaitic Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. He looks upon everything as a dream. The Vijnani embraces this universe as a mansion of mirth, and the Bangla phrase here is Mojar Kutu. Since the Vijnani sees that there's nothing in the universe but God. So this is the metaphor. Remember, going back to the passage, Sri Ramakrishna says the Jnani is the one who climbs up the steps one by one, reaches the roof. That's Brahma Jnana. That's the knowledge of the non-dual Brahman. But then the Vijnani, after reaching the roof, comes back and realizes that the stairs are made of the same material as the roof, which means that this entire world is nothing but a real manifestation of Shakti or God. So it's on the basis of this spiritual state of Vijnana that Sri Ramakrishna taught what I call a world-affirming Advaitic philosophy. I'm not saying that, so as if any of you have read my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, published in 2018, I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta. One thing I wanted to clarify, many people who don't read the book, they jump to conclusions about the book, which is unfortunate. Please read the book before you make any judgments about it. But I explained very clearly in the first chapter of the book that Vijnana Vedanta is itself an Advaitic philosophy. It's not that Sri Ramakrishna was not an Advaita. He was an Advaita. But his Advaita is what I call an integral Advaita or a world-affirming Advaita philosophy. Because it accepts the reality of this world and the reality of Shakti. So if Shankara, we know that his formula, it's in one of his lesser-known works, Brahma Jnana Avadhi. It's a shorter text. He says, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahma Vinaparaha. But Sri Ramakrishna, by contrast, says, this is my statement. This is not Sri Ramakrishna's own word, but this is my way of putting it into a formula. Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. So the ultimate reality is not just Nirguna Brahman, but also Shakti. And so I'm treating them as the same reality. Brahma Shakti Satyam. And therefore Jagat is also Satyam. Jagat is Satyam. And if any of you know anything about the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition, one of Sri Ramakrishna's great monastic disciples, Swami Turiyanandaji, toward the end of his life, just several days before he left his body, he said something very similar. He said, Brahma Shatto, Jagat Shatto, Shabi Shatto, Shatte Pran Pratishtita. Brahman is real, Brahman is true. Jagat, this universe is also real, everything is real. Life itself is grounded in the truth. And this is a very Aurobindonian kind of statement, but the thing I wanted to emphasize, and which I think a lot of people don't realize, is that this kind of integral Advaitic philosophy originates with Sri Aurobindo, with Sri Ramakrishna, sorry. And Sri Ramakrishna himself, he never claimed any kind of originality in that sense. He always said that if you read the original scriptures, you'll find that this Vijnana kind of outlook on the world, you'll find this in the Upanishads, you'll find it in the Bhagavad Gita, you'll find it in texts like the Bhagavata Purana and in Adhyatma Ramayana. If you look at the Kathamrita, he often says that you'll find this Vijnana kind of outlook in these ancient scriptures. Now, keep all this in mind as we now turn to Sri Aurobindo. So, how was Sri Aurobindo influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda? I just wanted to briefly discuss this. I'm not going to go into too many details. So between 1908 and 1912, Sri Aurobindo received 3 messages on a mystical plane from Sri Ramakrishna. I give citations. The CWSA means the complete works of Sri Aurobindo. Many of you probably know that you can download the entire complete works as PDFs online for free. So those are the volume numbers, 10 through 11, by the way. So Sri Aurobindo himself said he received 3 messages from Sri Ramakrishna mystically, because 1908, Sri Ramakrishna left his body in 1886. In a 1913 letter to a disciple, Sri Aurobindo says explicitly, remember also that we derive from Ramakrishna. For myself, it was Ramakrishna who personally came and first turned me to this yoga. So it's very clear that Sri Aurobindo is stating that never forget that our entire integral yoga is derived from Sri Ramakrishna. And in May 1908, Sri Aurobindo was imprisoned for a year in Kolkata's Alipur jail for his political activities. He was one of the great freedom fighters early in his life. And Sri Aurobindo claimed that Swami Vivekananda mystically communicated to him various kinds of spiritual instructions about meditation at that time while he was in jail. So this is what Sri Aurobindo says. Vivekananda in the Alipur jail gave me the foundations of that knowledge, which is the basis of our sadhana. So he was clearly very strong. Sri Aurobindo himself explicitly acknowledges the very strong influence of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And it's also important to recognize that Sri Aurobindo this is something mentioned by Sri Gautam Banerjee in the introduction, but one thing that's very important and unique about Sri Aurobindo is that he was
Hello, Swami.
Yes, namaste.
Namaste. It's so interesting what you're saying, but the volume is very low, so we can't hear. Would you mind speaking up a bit, because my mom is elderly and she's really struggling to hear you clearly, and we increase the volume on the iPad to the maximum, but we can't hear.
Yeah, Buddhadev, can you, is the volume okay for you, or is it too low?
It's low for me as well.
Oh, I see.
That's much better. Yes, that's much better. Thank you so much.
You can. Can everyone hear me now? Fine. No.
We can hear you.
Okay, I'll continue then.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I'll try to speak louder. So, one thing that's very important and unique about Sri Aurobindo is that he was not just a scholar, but he was also a great yogi and mystic in his own right. And that's important to keep in mind. So I wanted to mention some of his formative spiritual experiences, which are very similar to what Sri Ramakrishna called Jnana and Vijnana. So Sri Aurobindo had, in January 1908, he met in Baroda a yogi named Vishnu Bhaskar Lele, who instructed him in meditation. And after 3 days of training under Lele, Sri Aurobindo explains that he had a series of tremendously powerful experiences which made him see with a stupendous intensity the world as a cinematographic play of vacant forms in the impersonal universality of the absolute Brahman. So it should be clear, I think, that this experience, and in fact in other places in letters, Sri Aurobindo confirmed that this experience in 1908 that he had when he was training under Lele was the Advaitic realization of Nirguna Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. He says it explicitly. This idea that this realization that Brahman, Nirguna Brahman alone is Satya and that Jagat is Mithya, that he saw everything as a kind of dream or as a kind of movie. So this corresponds to what Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana, Advaitic jnana. But Sri Aurobindo then, just a few months later, he was imprisoned in jail, in the Alipur jail, and he said that he practiced the sadhana of the Bhagavad Gita. And as a result of this sadhana, he had a transformative mystical experience, which is very similar, I think, to what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vigya. Sri Aurobindo says, I looked at the jail that secluded me from men, and it was no longer by its high walls that I was imprisoned. No, it was Vasudeva who surrounded me. I looked at the prisoners in the jail, the thieves, the murderers, the swindlers, and as I looked at them, I saw Vasudeva. It was Narayana whom I found in these darkened souls and misused bodies. So remember that according to Sri Ramakrishna, the Vijnani sees that absolutely everything in this world is a manifestation of the same God. And Sri Aurobindo in this experience in jail also had the same kind of realization that absolutely everything, inanimate and animate, is nothing but Krishna himself. And just a few years later, in 1912, he wrote an essay called The Yoga and Its Objects. He never actually published it, but I think it's a very important essay for understanding how his early spiritual experiences shaped his subsequent spiritual philosophy, which he codified and elaborated in his masterpiece, The Life Divine, much later. So in The Yoga and Its Objects, this is my suggestion, and I explain this in more detail in my scholarly work. I can point you to articles later if you have questions. So he draws implicitly upon, Sri Aurobindo draws implicitly upon Sri Ramakrishna's distinction between jnana and vijnana in order to explain, to articulate or distinguish three fundamental stages in spiritual realization. Stage one is, he explains, Advaitic Atmajnana, the knowledge of the one divine impersonal existence, from the perspective of which the one may seem to be the only reality and everything else maya, a purposeless and inexplicable illusion. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. And remember from the previous slide that Sri Aurobindo had exactly this Advaitic realization during his training under Lele, Vishnu Bhaskar. But the stages in spiritual realization. Stage two is when one exceeds the merely impersonal realization of Advaita, this Nirguna Brahman, and comes to experience, quote, that even the names and forms are Brahman. Namarupa itself is a real manifestation of Brahman. And the third and final stage, which Sri Aurobindo explains in this essay, The Yoga and Its Objects, he says, is to perceive all things as God. And it is this realization of Vijnana, what Sri Ramakrishna calls Vijnana, that he seems to have experienced for the first time in the Alipur jail. And this is another description of Sri Aurobindo's, of this experience. He says, but the crowning realization of this yoga is when you become aware of the whole world as the expression, play, or lila of an infinite divine personality. When you see in all, not the impersonal Sat-Atman, which is the basis of manifest existence, although you do not lose that knowledge, but Sri Krishna, who at once is, bases, and transcends all manifest and unmanifest existence. So it's on the basis of these profound spiritual experiences of jnana and vijnana, and under the influence of the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhananda, that Sri Aurobindo went on to produce an extraordinarily impressive and philosophically sophisticated and original corpus. And if you look at the complete works, I think it runs into 44 or 45 volumes, something like that. And I think it's still growing. And in his works, and some of his main works include The Life Divine, Savitri, The Synthesis of Yoga, and there are a number of books where he commented on the scriptures, like The Secret of the Veda. He wrote full-length commentaries on the Iśā Upaniṣad and on Kena Upanishad, and he wrote an entire book called Essays on the Gita. So, in any case, in The Life Divine, he outlines in great detail what he calls a realistic Advaita philosophy, and he summarizes beautifully in just a few sentences the main philosophy explained in his Life Divine. He says this in a letter, Letters on Yoga, Volume 2. Sri Aurobindo says, there is possible a realistic as well as an illusionist Advaita. The philosophy of the Life Divine is such a realistic Advaita. The world is a manifestation of the real and therefore is itself real. The reality is the infinite and eternal divine, infinite and eternal being, consciousness force, and bliss. That is Sat-Chit Ananda. This divine, by his power, has created the world, or rather manifested it in his own infinite being. So in this passage, Sri Aurobindo distinguishes two kinds of Advaita philosophy, what he calls illusionist Advaita and realistic Advaita. And he's aligning the illusionist Advaita philosophy with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. According to Shankara's illusionist Advaita philosophy, the sole reality is the impersonal and attributeless, this nirguna Brahman, pure consciousness, which only appears to manifest as this world due to our ignorance. That's what's called Vivartavada in traditional Advaita Vedanta. By contrast, according to Sri Aurobindo's realistic Advaita philosophy, the divine Satchitananda is both personal, saguna, and also impersonal, nirguna. So for Sri Aurobindo, the Sat aspect of Satchitananda, so that Sat, corresponds to the impersonal absolute, nirguna Brahman, accepted by Shankara and his followers. While the Chit aspect of Sat-Chit Ananda, the second term, Chit, is what Sri Aurobindo calls consciousness force, or Chit Shakti, which is personal and dynamic, and which has the inherent capacity to manifest as everything in this world. So Sri Aurobindo, unlike Shankara, holds that everything in the world is a real manifestation of divine consciousness. So that's why he calls his Advaitic philosophy realistic Advaita, because it says, remember, just like I said that Sri Ramakrishna taught Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam, this is exactly what Sri Aurobindo also taught. Now, with all that background in place, we can now start thinking about and analyzing Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad. So keep in your mind in the background that Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of all the Vedantic scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita, the Upanishads, he didn't write a commentary on the Brahma Sutra, as far as I'm aware, and also his interpretation of the Vedas, the Secret of the Veda, he wrote a big book on that. These are all informed, as he himself stated in the passage that I read earlier. All of his interpretations of these scriptures of the Vedas and of Vedanta were strongly informed by the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhananda. So this is something mentioned by Sri Gautam Banerjee. But Sri Aurobindo, one thing that's really striking about his interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad is that he gives a kind of holistic interpretation. He tries to understand what is the underlying principle or the unifying principle of the entire Upanishad. It's one of the shortest Upanishads. It's only 18 verses. And his claim is that the main principle of the entire Upanishad that informs every one of the 18 mantras is, quote, the uncompromising reconciliation of uncompromising extremes. What you'll find if you read the Iśā Upaniṣadic mantras themselves, independently of any commentaries, what most people will find is that it seems to be full of apparent contradictions. And what the Iśā Upaniṣad does, according to Sri Aurobindo, is it reconciles all of these apparent contradictions or opposites. So this is what Sri Aurobindo says specifically. He says that the Iśā Upaniṣad resolves sequentially the following 9 pairs of opposites or apparent contradictions. First, the apparent contradiction between God on the one hand and the world on the other. This, he claims, is reconciled in the first line of the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad. The second apparent contradiction occurs in the second line of the first verse, and it's the contradiction between renunciation on the one hand and enjoyment on the other. Tena tyaktena munjita. We'll get to that later in this presentation. The third contradiction, external action and internal freedom. That's reconciled in verse 2. The fourth contradiction or opposite, the one stable Brahman and the multiple movement. This is reconciled in verses 4 and 5. There seems to be an apparent contradiction between being and becoming. And this contradiction is resolved in verses 6 through 7. In verse 8, there's an apparent tension or contradiction between the dynamic personal God and the transcendent impersonal Brahman, between Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. And in verses 9 to 11, so some of the most cryptic verses in the Iśā Upaniṣad are 9 to 14. There are three triads, 9 to 11 and 12 to 14. And they're very difficult to interpret. Sri Aurobindo has a very original interpretation of them. And his claim is that verses 9 to 11 resolve the apparent contradiction between vidya, knowledge, and avidya, ignorance. And that verses 12 to 14 resolve the apparent contradiction between birth, sambhuti on the one hand, and non-birth, asambhuti on the other. And finally, the final four verses, 15 through 18, reconcile the apparent contradiction between works, karma on the one hand, and knowledge, jnana on the other. So this is an overview of Sri Aurobindo's entire interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad. I obviously am not going to be able to discuss every mantra, every one of the 18 mantras. If you're interested in Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the entire Upanishad, first I would recommend that you read his original commentary, and if you want a kind of guide for understanding his sometimes difficult commentary, you can look at the scholarly works that I'll mention at the end of my presentation. So what I'm going to focus on today is just his interpretations of verses 1, 2, and 8 of the Iśā Upaniṣad. And then I'd like to hear from you and we can have a conversation. So before we get into the individual verses, I wanted to say something about how he understands the overall structure, the overall architecture of the Iśā Upaniṣad. He claims that these 9 pairs of opposites, which I just explained in the previous slide, are worked out symmetrically in 4 successive movements of thought. This is a very subtle idea, so I wanted to explain that. What he means is that he thinks that the first 3 mantras, 1 through 3, which comprise what he calls the first movement of thought in this Upanishad, they contain all of the main ideas of the Iśā Upaniṣad. And Sri Aurobindo claims that the remaining 15 mantras, encompassing the second, third, and fourth movements of thought, explain and amplify the ideas of the first 3 verses in a sequential and symmetrical manner, which I illustrated in this diagram. I hope it's helpful. It took me a long time to make this diagram. So this is how roughly I think Sri Aurobindo's understanding of the structure of the Iśā Upaniṣad looks. The first movement of thought is contained in the first 3 mantras, as I've explained, and verses 4 through 7 comprise what he calls the second movement of thought, and they are nothing but an expansion on the ideas contained in verse 1. He says that verses 8 through 14, mantras 8 through 14, constitute the third movement of thought of this Upanishad, and these mantras explain and amplify the ideas contained in the second verse, the second mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad. That's why you see the arrow going to verse 2. And finally, the fourth movement of thought is contained in verses 15 through 18. And according to Sri Aurobindo, these last 4 mantras expand on the ideas contained in the third mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad. That's why the arrow is going up to verse 3. So this diagram, I hopefully explains in a simpler way what Sri Aurobindo means by this symmetrical structure of the Iśā Upaniṣad. I explain this in more detail in one of my articles, which I'll mention at the end of my presentation. So now we can get into Sri Aurobindo's translation and interpretation of some of the mantras of the Iśā Upaniṣad. Let's look at 1 and 2 first. So I'll read the Sanskrit first. There are many Sanskrit pundits in the audience, so it's not for them, but for the others in the audience. Isha vasimidam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaptena bhunjitha ma grida kasya svithanam. Kurvan neveha karmani jivished shatangasamaha evam tvai nanyate tosti na karma likatena ve. So this is Sri Aurobindo's translation, and one thing to keep in mind is there's no such thing as a neutral translation. So translation itself inevitably involves interpretation. And we're going to see this as we compare Sri Aurobindo's, first of all, keep in mind Sri Aurobindo's translations of these verses when we think about his interpretations of these verses. And then we'll look at Gambhiranandaji's translation of Shankaracharya's Sanskrit commentaries on the same verses, and we'll find that the translation is very different. So in any case, these are Sri Aurobindo's translations. He says, all this is for habitation by the Lord. Whatsoever is individual universe of movement in the universal motion. By that renounced, thou shouldest enjoy. Lust not after any man's possession. And then the second mantra, doing verily works in this world, one should wish to live 100 years. Thus it is in thee, and not otherwise in this. Action cleaves not to a man. So, before we get into Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, I wanted to mention briefly that Swami Vivekananda, in an 1896 lecture delivered in London called God in Everything, he gave a pretty detailed interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad. And I think that this may have also been an influence on Sri Aurobindo. So this is what Swami Vivekananda says. He says, here I can only lay before you what the Vedanta seeks to teach, and that is the deification of the world. The Vedanta does not in reality denounce the world. It really means deification of the world. Giving up the world as we think of it, as we know it, as it appears to us, and to know what it really is. Deify it. It is God alone. We read at the commencement of one of the oldest of the Upanishads, whatever exists in this universe is to be covered with the Lord. So notice this is his translation of the first line of the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad. Then Swami Vivekananda said, we have to cover everything with the Lord himself, not by a false sort of optimism, not by blinding our eyes to the evil, but by really seeing God in everything. So, and then he says, in the same lecture, he interprets the second line of the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad, Tena Tyaktena Bhunjitaha, as follows. He says, when we have given up desires, then alone shall we be able to read and enjoy this universe of God. So notice that the Tena Tyaktena he interprets as the tyaga, the renunciation of kama, of desires. And he interprets Bhunjitaha to mean enjoy. Enjoy this world by seeing it as a manifestation of God, as Iśā Vasyamidam. So keep this in mind. What we'll find is that Sri Aurobindo interprets these first two verses in a very similar manner as Swami Vivekananda, and in light of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana. So this is Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the first line of the first verse. I'm just repeating, I'm including the translation at the top just so that, in case, for those of you who haven't memorized the Upanishad. So, the first line of the first verse, according to Sri Aurobindo, resolves the apparent antithesis between, on the one hand, the eternal, immutable, perfect God, and on the other hand, the transient, changing, imperfect world. And it does this by affirming that the world is God's dwelling place. So, the word Vasyam has different meanings in different contexts, but Sri Aurobindo thinks that the best interpretation of this context is that this world is for habitation, for dwelling by the Lord. So it's God's dwelling place. So according to Sri Aurobindo, the first line of the first verse affirms the panentheistic view that God is both immanent and transcendent. God not only transcends the world, but also rules and inhabits it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with this term panentheism, what it means is, so pantheism is a term that might be more familiar. Pantheism means that God is nothing but this world, but nothing over and above the world. And panentheism means God is this world, but God is also something beyond the world. Okay, so that's the difference. And I think Sri Aurobindo would take this first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad to teach a kind of panentheism, because it teaches that God is immanent in this world, and God is also beyond this world. And now, with regard to the second line of the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad, I think Sri Aurobindo follows both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda in claiming that the second line of the first verse resolves the opposition between renunciation, tyaga, on the one hand, and enjoyment, bhoga, on the other, by telling us to enjoy this world through renunciation. So that's how he interprets Tena Tyaktena Bhunjitaha. So the key is, just like Swami Vivekananda said, what we need to renounce is not anything external in the world, but our internal desires for the things of the world. So this is a direct quotation from Sri Aurobindo's commentary. Sri Aurobindo says, real integral enjoyment of all this movement and multiplicity in its truth and in its infinity depends upon an absolute renunciation. But the renunciation intended is an absolute renunciation of the principle of desire, founded on the principle of egoism, and not a renunciation of world existence. So it's important that to understand Sri Aurobindo's approach, that when he interprets tena tyaptena bhunjita, he understands the tyaga here as renunciation of internal desire rather than of external action. Now, keep that in mind, because it's very important in understanding how he understands the transition from the first to the second mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad. So I've just reproduced at the top of the slide again his translation of the second verse. He says that there's a very natural transition, there's a very natural segue from the first to the second mantra. Remember that the Upanishad has just told us in the second line of the first mantra that we should enjoy this world by seeing it as a real manifestation of God. And we do that, we can enjoy this world by renouncing our egoism and our desire. And that sets up the second mantra, because in the second mantra, the Upanishad, the Rishi says, since the Lord manifests himself in life and works, the Iśā Upaniṣad encourages us to manifest our divinity by affirming life and action in the world. Which means we should continue to continue all our actions in this world and try to live up to 100 years. We should do this, however, grounded in God, grounded in the knowledge that everything in this world is nothing but God and we are servants of God. So this is what Sri Aurobindo says. The second mantra instructs us to perform our duties in the world throughout our life, but in the spirit of non-attachment. We should do it in the spirit of nishkama karma. Life and works can and should be accepted in their fullness, for the manifestation of the Lord in life and works is the law of our being and the object of our world existence. Now, let's compare Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the first two mantras of the Iśā Upaniṣad with Shankara's interpretation. So, this is Swami Gambhiranandaji's English translation of the first line of the first mantra. Isha vasamidam sarvam yat kincha jagatyam jagat. So, Gambhiranandaji's translation is, of course, colored by Shankara's interpretation, because he's translating Shankara's commentary. So, all this, whatsoever moves on the earth, should be covered by the Lord. And according to Shankara, the meaning of the first line of the first verse is that all this that is unreal, anritam idam sarvam, whether moving or not moving, is to be covered, acchadaniyam, by one's own supreme Atman. So he glosses idam sarvam, isha vasim idam sarvam. This idam sarvam, he adds another word, a very important word, anritam idam sarvam. So he's inserting into this first verse the idea of jagat mithyatva, that this world is actually unritam, it's not ultimately real. And he claims that the thrust of this first mantra is that we should ignore this unreal world and contemplate instead our true swarupa, which is the supreme truth of the Atman, the non-dual Atman, Nirguna Brahman. This is Shankara's interpretation. Ignore this world, which is unreal, it's just a dream, and you should realize your true nature as the Atman. And now, how does he interpret the second line of the first mantra? First of all, this is Gambhiranandaji's translation of the second line from the standpoint of Shankaracharya. Protect yourself through that detachment. Do not covet anybody's wealth. Tena tyaptena bhunjitaha ma grida kasya siddhana. So, the word bhunjitaha poses a serious problem for Shankara, because according to Panini's grammar, many Sanskrit students and pundits in the audience, they know this better than me, but in Ashtadhyayi, Panini, the sutra is 1.3.66, Rujonavane. Panini says that if you conjugate the dhatu, bhunj, in the Atmanepada form, it must mean enjoy or eat. And if it's in the Parasmaipada form, you can interpret it to mean protect. The problem is Bhunjitaha is the Atmanepada form of Bhuj. So Shankara is in trouble because he has to depart from Panini grammar, and he usually doesn't. He usually follows Panini, but in this case, he departs from Panini in glossing, in explaining that Bhunjitaha means Balayetaha. That's the Sanskrit word that Shankara uses in his commentary, which means protect. Because if he can't interpret it to mean engage in bhoga, enjoy this world, because it doesn't seem to accord with his Advaitic philosophy, which is based on renunciation of enjoyment. So he says that if we take Bhunjitaha to mean Palayataha, protect, then we can make sense of this verse. So he interprets Tena Tyaptena Bhunjitaha to mean through renunciation of works, of action, you should protect through the practice of Jnana Yoga. And this first verse is meant for Jnana Yogis, those who are fit to practice Jnana Yoga. And the other problem for Shankara is that if we take Bhunjitaha to mean protect in English and also in Sanskrit, it has to take a direct object, a karma in the grammatical sense. You have to protect something, right? So what is being protected? Nothing in the verse it seems to be mentioned as something to be protected. So Shankara has to add the word Atman, and he says that what the Upanishad means is you should balayataha, you should protect the Atman through renunciation of all action. Okay, so this is an interpretation. He has to do a lot of kind of gymnastics to arrive at this interpretation. And then he interprets the second mantra in this way. First of all, this is Gambhiranji's English translation of the second mantra. By doing karma, indeed, should one wish to live here for 100 years. For a man such as you who wants to live thus, there is no other way than this, whereby karma may not cling to you. So the second verse is also a big problem for Shankara, because if he interprets the first verse as addressed to Jnana Yogis, who should be renouncing action. And now suddenly the second mantra is saying, don't renounce action, continue to work. For the rest of your life, try to live for 100 years doing actions. So it's a big problem. So what does Shankara do? This is a very common strategy among Advaitic commentators of the scriptures. He invokes the Advaitic doctrine of Adhikari Bheda, the doctrine of differing competencies. According to Shankara, the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad enjoins renunciation of all action for spiritually evolved aspirants, for Uttama Adhikaris, who are qualified for Jnana Yoga. While the second mantra of the same Upanishad enjoins action. It says that they should engage in action, but these are not meant for the same Uttama Adhikaris, they're meant for Manda Adhikaris, less evolved aspirants who are only qualified for Karma Yoga and not for Jnana Yoga. So Shankara says that the second mantra is meant for one who is unable to grasp the Atman as a result of his preoccupation with the non-self. In other words, the second mantra is for people who have not attained sufficient purity of mind, Chitta Shuddhi, to be eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. For them, they should continue to practice Karma Yoga for the rest of their lives. Maybe in a future life, they may be lucky enough to have a sufficiently pure mind to practice Jnana Yoga and realize Brahman. This is Shankara's interpretation. Now, Sri Aurobindo, he was fully aware of Shankara's interpretation, and he explicitly criticized in his own commentary on the Iśā Upaniṣad. So, first of all, with regard to the first mantra, Sri Aurobindo claims that Shankara's claim that this first mantra teaches that this world is unreal. Remember that Shankara adds the word anritam before idam sarvam. So the word anritam is not found in the original Upanishad itself, but Shankara adds the term to make it seem as if the Upanishad is teaching that everything in this world is anritam, which means ultimately unreal. From the Paramatmika standpoint, from the ultimate standpoint, this world is unreal. And what Sri Aurobindo says is, this idea that the Upanishad teaches the unreality of the world, that we should renounce it, it contradicts the whole thought of the Upanishad, which doesn't suggest anywhere that this world is unreal. And I don't want to take a strong stand on this. I want each of you to think for yourself about which interpretation do you find more plausible and why. But according to Sri Aurobindo, he thinks that it's implausible to take the first mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad to mean that we should renounce this unreal world. In particular because, remember, the Shankara adds the word unritam, which is not found in the first mantra. And with regard to the second line of the first mantra, remember that Shankara has to depart from Paninian grammar because he interprets punjitaha, which is in the Atmanepada form, as protect, which is not the meaning in the Atmanepada form according to Panini. It should mean protect, it should mean enjoy or eat. But Sri Aurobindo, like Swami Vivekananda and like Sri Ramakrishna, they can very easily interpret the word punjitaha in its natural sense, which is strictly in accordance with Paninian grammar. It just means enjoy. How should we enjoy this world? We should enjoy this world through the inner renunciation of desire. And through that inner renunciation, we can enjoy this world as just as Sri Ramakrishna said, as a modarkuti. We can enjoy this world as a manifestation of God itself. So you'll find that there's a very consistent interpretation, starting with Sri Ramakrishna and then going to Swami Vivekananda and then Sri Aurobindo, saying that it's very easy to interpret this Upanishadic mantra to mean that we should enjoy this world as a manifestation of God through the renunciation of egoism and desire. But by contrast, Shankara has to kind of depart from Paninian grammar in that sense, in order to interpret punjitaha to mean protect rather than enjoy. And with regard to the second mantra, kurvanneveya karmani jivishet shatagrisamaha, Sri Aurobindo says it's not at all plausible, it's forced and unnatural to claim that the second mantra is a concession to the ignorant, that it's meant for manda adhikaris who are only meant for karma yoga. Why does he think that? Well, because there's no internal evidence. There's no evidence in the text itself, or at least that's his claim. There's no evidence in the mantras themselves of the Upanishad that the first mantra is meant for uttama adhikaris and that the second mantra is meant for manda adhikaris. And Sri Aurobindo is not alone. After Sri Aurobindo, a number of modern scholars, including Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan and Swami Harshananda, who just passed away recently. He was the head of the Bangalore Ashrama of the Ramakrishna Mission. He wrote a nice Sanskrit commentary on the Iśā Upaniṣad called Viveka Sukhavati. And it's a new interpretation, a new commentary on the Iśā Upaniṣad from the standpoint of Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And he makes the same point, that he thinks that Shankara is wrong in interpreting the second verse as meant for manda adhikaris. He says that it's much more natural to interpret the entire Upanishad consistently as meant for everybody. So Sri Aurobindo says the same thing. Okay, now, before concluding my presentation, I wanted to briefly talk about Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the 8th verse of the Iśā Upaniṣad. This is the 8th verse. This is Sri Aurobindo's translation. So first I'll read the Sanskrit. Saparyagat shukram akayam apranam asnaviram shuddham apapavitham Kavir manishi paribhu swayambhur yathatatyato than vyadadhat shashvatibhyat samadhya. This is his translation. It is he that has gone abroad, that which is bright, bodiless, without scar of imperfection, without sinews, pure, unpierced by evil. The seer, the thinker, the one who becomes everywhere, the self-existent, has ordered objects perfectly according to their nature from years sempiternal. Now, this mantra is about the nature of God, right, and God's relation to this world. So according to Sri Aurobindo, this mantra, this 8th mantra, affirms that one and the same infinite divine reality is both personal and impersonal, both static and dynamic, and both immanent in this world and beyond this world. And one thing that's very striking about Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of this mantra is that he claims that the grammar of the words in this mantra reflects the impersonal, personal nature of God. So he says, he brings our attention to the fact that in the first line of the 8th verse, only neuter adjectives are used. Napumsaka linga words, beginning with shukram. So remember, shukram, akayam, avranam, asnaviram, shuddham, apapavitham. These are all in the napumsaka linga, the neuter gender. And he says, this corresponds, he's interpreting, he thinks that that's very significant, that this napumsaka linga, the neuter gender, corresponds to what Sri Aurobindo calls the pure and silent Brahman, which is the Nirguna Brahman taught in traditional Advaita Vedanta. While notice that in the second line, masculine nouns are used, starting with kavihi, manishihi, paribhuhu, swayambhuhu, right? These are all masculine gender. Punglinga. He says the masculine nouns are used to indicate the personal, active Brahman, the Lord who becomes everything and everyone in the universe. It's what Sri Ramakrishna called Shakti. So the grammar itself of this mantra, the grammatical form of the adjectives in this mantra correspond to the personal and impersonal aspects of the same divine reality. So you can see here how creative and how original Sri Aurobindo's interpretations of the scriptures were. And then he makes a very important point. He says, it is an error to conceive that the Upanishads teach the true existence only of an impersonal and actionless Brahman, an impersonal God without power or quality. This is clearly the Nirguna Brahman taught by Shankara and his followers. They declare, so the Upanishads declare rather an unknowable that manifests itself to us in a double aspect of personality and impersonality. So while Shankara maintains that the Brahman of the Upanishads is ultimately impersonal, Nirguna, and not Saguna, it's only Saguna from the standpoint of ignorance. Shankara clearly says this in his Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Other traditional Vedantic commentators, such as Ramanuja and Madhva, they claim that the Upanishadic Brahman is only personal, Saguna, and they say that Brahman is not Nirguna. So there have been many centuries of debates between traditional acharyas within the school of Vedanta, arguing what is the true nature of Brahman. And what Sri Aurobindo says is, if you study and meditate on the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita deeply, you'll find that they don't make any kind of hierarchy between Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. They say that Brahman is both Saguna and Nirguna. This is exactly in line with Sri Ramakrishna. So this is the way I put it. I would say that Sri Aurobindo rejects what could be called the either-or approach of traditional commentators like Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, in favor of Sri Ramakrishna's both-and approach. The Upanishads teach that God is both the loving personal God, Shakti, Chit Shakti, and the impersonal, non-dual absolute, and also beyond both personality and impersonality. So remember Sri Ramakrishna's teachings on Vijnana. The Vijnani sees that the reality, which is Nirguna, is also Saguna. Those who realize Brahman in Samadhi come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living being. And in another place in the Kathamrita, Sri Ramakrishna says, God is with form, without form, and much more besides. Tini Shakar, Nirakar, Abar Kotoki. So I think it's very clear from these kinds of interpretations that Sri Aurobindo is very clearly drawing on Sri Ramakrishna's own teachings on Vijnana, and he's drawing on his own spiritual experiences. Now, as I mentioned, this presentation could go on all day. If I were to explain all 18 of the mantras, I'm not going to do that. I'll stop here. If any of you are interested in my more detailed, comprehensive explanation of Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad, you can look at two of my scholarly articles. The first one is called Seeing Oneness Everywhere, Sri Aurobindo's mystico-immanent interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad. It's a chapter in this volume, which I've edited, called the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta, published last year. And what I do in that article is I first of all explain Sri Aurobindo's hermeneutic approach, which was influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Medhananda. And then I compare his interpretation of each verse, each mantra of the Iśā Upaniṣad with traditional commentators like Shankara and Ramanuja and Madhva, and I compare his interpretations with modern scholars. There are many modern scholars who have written on the same Upanishad. And then I argue that Sri Aurobindo's interpretation has a lot of merits, have a lot of advantages over these other interpretations. And I've more recently published an article just a few months ago in the journal Religions. And that article is called Why Sri Aurobindo's Hermeneutics Still Matters, Philology and the Transformative Possibilities of Scripture. These two articles are very related. They're kind of cousins of each other. And in this article, what I do is I compare Sri Aurobindo's interpretation of the Iśā Upaniṣad with Shankara's interpretation and with one modern German scholar named Paul Thieme, Thieme. And again, I argue that modern scholars should take more seriously Sri Aurobindo's interpretation. He's almost universally ignored by Western scholars and, by most Indian scholars of the scriptures. And I argue here that his interpretation has a lot of merit and should be taken seriously. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Our forum is open for the question answer session. So if anyone interested, please can see the task with Maharaj. Let me check on Facebook Live and the YouTube Live there. You can use the YouTube Live comment section and the Facebook comment also. And any language you can just ask anything regarding this topic. So in between, Maharaj, I have a question to you. So the thing is, when we are giving such a statement like Brahma Shakti Satyam and Jagat Satyam, can you please clarify what do you mean by this Satya? As Vedanti seems to explain Yas Upaniṣad Navjavicharati like that, which does not change in any condition from actual state. So what does you mean by this term Satya?
Yeah, I mean, okay, again, look, it's not, the whole presentation is about Sri Aurobindo's interpretation, right? So what did Sri Aurobindo mean by real? What does Sri Ramakrishna mean by real? Sri Ramakrishna often said, in one place, Mahanana Gutta, in the Kathamrita, he asked Sri Ramakrishna, is this world real or unreal? Is it mithya? And then Sri Aurobindo said, Sri Ramakrishna said, mithya kena hobe? Ocha bichare kotha. Lilao shotto. And here, Sri Ramakrishna and Sri Aurobindo, and I think Swami Medhananda, they would interpret, they would say that, look, just because something is anitya doesn't make it unreal, right? And it might, a good example would be this. I construct a table out of a piece of wood, okay? And then I smash that table after a few days. Does it make sense to say that because this table only existed for a few days that the table wasn't real? It doesn't make much sense, as far as I can tell. So it's more intuitive to say that it was real while it lasted. So in the same way, this world is a real, but a dynamic and an impermanent manifestation of God. But in one sense, it's permanent because this world is permanent in the sense that, according to the Hindu view, creation is cyclical, right? So even at the end of the cycle of creation, it'll contract into a bija, the form of a bija rupa, right? So in the form of a seed, but it doesn't just disappear. So it never actually goes away. So even on the assumption that reality is defined in terms of permanence and impermanence, you can arguably say that this world is real even on that standard, because even in the bija rupa form, it's not actually unreal. But I don't think Sri Aurobindo defines reality in that narrow way. He doesn't say that only that which is permanent is real. He says that, look, there's just a more intuitive kind of understanding of reality, which just means, is it sublated by some kind of higher knowledge? Maybe that's it, like badita is a Sanskrit word. So according to traditional Advaitins, in the state of Brahma-jnana, this world is badita, it's cancelled, it's sublated, it no longer exists. So therefore, we can infer from that highest spiritual experience that this world is ultimately unreal. It's unreal from the Paramahantika standpoint. But Sri Aurobindo will say that's not true, that there's a further spiritual experience, what Sri Ramakrishna calls vijnana, and what Sri Aurobindo also calls vijnana. That's how he interprets the term vijnana in the Bhagavad Gita, actually. And he says that, no, there's a further spiritual experience where you realize that this world is the real manifestation of God. So, I mean, unfortunately, I can't give you a precise definition of reality, because I'm not sure that Sri Aurobindo himself gives a kind of a neat definition in the way that traditional Advaitins do. But this is my take on how he would answer that question. Thank you.
Okay, that's another view on it. I think our viewers want to go to depth on it, so that they can ask questions, because it is not so much discussed things in general meetings and lectures. So I think it was a delightful lecture, I must say. We know we can have more chance to listen, but as every beginning always has its end, and the whole knowledge can be grasped in a day. So after thanking you all, we must conclude here today's session with Maharaj's permission. Maharaj, we can conclude the session now?
Yes, of course, yes. But really, nobody has questions, huh? I'm surprised, actually. I thought that I've raised a lot of controversial issues and all sorts of things, so don't be shy.
To ask questions?
Does anybody have any questions? Or there are no bad questions, as long as they're relevant. I want to make sure the questions are related to the presentation I gave rather than something else.
Can I ask you one?
Yes, please do.
Just a while ago you used the word Sat, but Sat and Satya, are the Satya and Sat, are they same? Because Sat means existence and the Satya is truth. Could you please elaborate, if you don't mind, if it is not irrelevant?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a good question. I think in my answer to this question, I used the word Satya. So I hope I wasn't, yeah. So in my presentation, I did refer to Sat, but that was in the context of explaining how Sri Aurobindo understands the nature of ultimate reality, which he calls Sat Chit Ananda, which is a traditional Vedantic understanding. But unlike traditional Advaita Vedantins, he understands that the Sat, that first, there are three terms, right? There's Sat, there's Chit, and there's Ananda. Sri Aurobindo interprets Sat there to mean Nirguna Brahman of Advaita Vedanta. And he interprets Chit to mean Chit Shakti, or consciousness force. So that's all I was saying. So Sat was used in the context of explaining Sri Aurobindo's understanding of the ultimate reality. Sat is the Nirguna, the impersonal, non-dual aspect of the infinite divine reality, which is also Chit Shakti. I hope that clarifies the difference between Sat and Satya.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone with another question?
Don't be shy.
Okay, if there are really no questions, we can stop.
Yeah. I have a question, if you don't mind. Again, it is little extension of the topic. Could be Satyam, Ritam, Brihat. I'm relating to this Satya. Could you connect this Ritam and Brihat with Satyam?
No, that's nice. Yeah, but again, that's Satyam, right? That's not Sat. But so are you saying that there's of course a kind of an etymological connection between Sat and Satya because of this common dhatu, right? In Sanskrit, it's based on dhatus. So, and it would be interesting it would be a nice research project actually to look at how Sri Aurobindo interprets the term Sat and Satya in the Upanishads and in the Vedas actually. If you look at Secret of the Vedas, and then thinking about whether there are etymological affinities, he does a lot of this kind of stuff in his commentary on the Iśā Upaniṣad. For instance, in the first, in several of the mantras, there are terms like Bhutani, which means creatures. That's the normal translation of Bhutani. But Sri Aurobindo gives it a more etymological interpretation. He says it comes from Bhu, the Bhu dhatu, which means becoming. And he gives a very original interpretation. So there's a lot of interesting work that can be done on looking at Satya and Sat in the context of Sri Aurobindo's thinking. But I would not be able to give you any kind of intelligent answer without doing careful research on the question. But it's a very nice question. Thank you.
But Ritam and Brihat, are they related to? I'm a little curious, but I don't think it is relevant here. But if you have time and if others are interested, I will deal.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting question, as I said, but I don't have anything worthwhile to say, but I don't want to say anything stupid, just off the cuff. I prefer, it's a deep question. It deserves a kind of deep thought out reply, which I would just feel embarrassed to say anything about that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I think the topic is also very and not much discussed. So viewers want to study on it. After that, they can come to the question. So, Maharaj, I think there has no question.
Maharaj, here I have. Yes, Maharaj, here I have a suggestion for the Rama sir here because Ritam means Satyam means Brahma. So here Brahma is depicted as Brihatvat Bimhanatvat Brahma iti. Arthat, can you get it, Maharaj?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Brihatvat Brimhanatvat Brahma. Here Brihat, the solution makes here Brihat iti. Buddhadev, have you got my point?
Yes, Maharaj, he wants to go to the semantics where Brahman comes from that Brihatva, the form of the Brihat. Brahma is the ultimate superposition, super state of this world or the everything we can experience. That's the thing. It is from Brahma Sutra, I think. So he is.
Yeah, no, I mean that's entirely possible. It's just I was explaining from the standpoint of Sri Aurobindo, and I think the more interesting question to ask is what was Sri Aurobindo's understanding? What would be his understanding of Satyam, Ridam, Brihat? And I honestly couldn't tell you. There's so many ways of interpreting it, right? So yeah, and that's one of them. Yeah, thank you, Rajat.
But thank you for, I'm happy. Thank you for presenting it in a very comprehensive way with Swami Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, and Shankar and Sri Aurobindo, bringing all of them together and giving a course. Sri Aurobindo talks about ultimate kind of thing, and I got it from your presentation. But thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, I think that Sri Aurobindo's commentary is not nearly as widely read as it should be, and part of the reason is because it's written in English, and many people don't feel comfortable with his English in particular because he wrote in a very sophisticated style of English, which is pretty intimidating, especially to some Indians whose mother tongue may not be English. But don't be intimidated, and if you have trouble just directly reading the commentary, what I would recommend you do is you can read my article on the Iśā Upaniṣad first, which I hope is written in a little bit more accessible English, and then you can go and read his commentary, which is written in a more this kind of British Victorian kind of style, which can be difficult. I love his English. I think it's incredible, and it has a kind of there's a spiritual depth and profundity to the English, but it's an acquired taste, and it's also it does require a certain level of background knowledge of the language and of philosophy, I would say. I mean, he studied at Cambridge, and he had a very subtle and profound mind. So it's not easy to understand Sri Aurobindo, but it's very rewarding, and it's worth the time and effort. Thank you. Yeah, I guess you can conclude the session with it, as long as nobody else has questions.
I'm personally thankful to Shakti official for giving me such an opportunity, and especially thanks to Ayon Maharaj to collect time from his very busy schedule and delivering this very, very insightful lecture. We must not forget about each effort of our members from the Shakti group who are doing the work in the end. So thanks to all, and we are extremely thankful to you, dear viewers or listeners, for engaging with us. We hope we can arrange a lecture like this in future also. With your support, till then, stay connected with Shakti. Thank you, and stay safe. Pranam to Maharaj. Thank you.